A November morning in Pennsylvania is cold enough to freeze the snot right out of your nose, and right now, these unremarkable Appalachian woods were crawling with 600,000 heavily armed, fanatic lunatics. Old Mickey was hunkered down in a 15-foot elevated deer blind, spiking his thermos of black coffee with bottom-shelf bourbon. His loaded Remington Model 700 rested quietly against the wooden rail. 300 yards away, an alien stealth vanguard ship cloaked in optical camouflage touched down in a clearing like an invisible ghost, its thrusters whipping the dead leaves into a chaotic frenzy. The alien commander had intended to use thermal imaging to pinpoint any stray indigenous life forms in this wilderness. Instead, he was horrified to discover the thermal signatures across the entire mountain range were packed as tight as a kicked-over hornet's nest. Before these extraterrestrial elites could even process the situation, Old Mickey had already locked his high-power scope onto the jarringly out-of-place optical distortion, shivering against the dead trees. "Don't care if you're some kinda albino mutant buck," Mickey muttered, spitting a stream of brown chewing tobacco. He pulled the trigger without a second thought. The deafening crack of the rifle tore through the dead silent valley, shattering the crisp morning air like a thunderclap. The supersonic .308 soft point slug ripped through the chill, nailing that eye-straining optical distortion dead center. A pale blue personal energy shield flared up in a sudden arc of light, brute forcing the bullet's penetration power to a dead halt. But all 2,700 foot-pounds of kinetic energy had to go somewhere. The raw impact slammed the alien scout, who had just slipped out of the stealth ship, 2 hard steps backward. His alloy combat boots ground through the dead leaves, as his center of gravity completely collapsed, bringing his heel down hard on a dead oak branch as thick as a man's wrist. Snap! The sharp crack popped like a firecracker, rolling a solid half-mile through woods, so quiet you could hear a pine needle drop. Mickey's brow knotted up instantly, the jaw muscle that had been working chewing tobacco for 30 years bulging hard. Head hunted these woods for 41 years. He knew the delicate snap of a deer stepping on a twig, and he knew the heavy thud of a black bear breaking a trunk. He had never, in his entire life, heard a crack that hard and crisp. Whatever snapped that branch weighed north of 300 pounds, and it had just eaten a hot-loaded .308 to the chest without spilling a single drop of blood before regaining its footing. His fingers hooked the bolt handle of the Remington 700, racking a second round while his eyes stayed glued to that patch of empty space by the oak trunk where sawdust was mysteriously fluttering to the ground. Aboard the stealth vanguard ship, the tactical console suddenly erupted into a shrieking alarm. Commander Valen's knuckles were still hovering over the thermal calibration keys he'd been adjusting for half an hour. Dead center on the holographic display, the green blip representing the scout flashed frantically, alongside a synchronized kinetic impact warning that nearly blew out the commander's eardrums. Cold sweat instantly soaked the collar of his interstellar vanguard combat uniform. For the past 20 minutes, he'd been cursing out his tech operatives, categorizing the overwhelming sea of red thermal blooms as a sensor malfunction caused by geothermal interference. But then that unmistakable, supersonic gunshot registered through the hull's seismic sensors. The audio signature match was undeniable, low-tech kinetic weaponry characteristic of carbon-based civilizations. It wasn't a glitch. This entire forest was swarming with living, warm-blooded, trigger-happy targets. Valen's fingers slashed across the standby unit interface. The personal shields of the remaining 9 fully equipped shock troopers were sitting at 100% capacity. He switched directly to the open tactical channel, his voice a cold, metallic clip that barely masked a tremor as it piped into their earpieces. All units activate optical camouflage immediately. Disembark and converge on the scout. Establish a 10-man assault formation. Fortify position and execute suppressive counterfire on the hostile origin point. 9 figures clad in matte black power armor rose from the bulkheads in unison. The airlock hissed as it depressurized. Heavy tactical boots stepped sequentially onto the frost-kissed layer of decaying leaves. Pale blue ripples washed over them as their optical camo engaged, erasing the 10 elite operatives entirely from the visual spectrum. Valen stared at the 10 stable green dots clustered on his holodisplay. He firmly pressed the command to remotely sync and activate the entire squad's thermal visors, waiting for them to feed the precise coordinates of this audacious indigenous sniper back to the command terminal. The absolute second the data stream hit the main console, the icy blue holographic screen violently strobed 3 times. The orderly cluster of green dots was instantly drowned in an apocalyptic flood of crimson flares. A system overload alarm began screaming like a banshee inside the cramped cabin. Valen slammed his palm onto the alarm kill switch, his knuckles turning white as he manually maxed out the thermal filtration threshold in a desperate bid to screen out ambient heat. But the red blooms didn't fade, they multiplied. They spread from the valley floor all the way up to the distant ridgelines. The entire forest was wall to wall with heat radiating primate biosignatures. The casualty estimation module's counter spun so fast it crashed into scrolling gibberish, utterly incapable of rendering a head count. The 10-man assault squad's comms channel exploded into pure chaos. Troopers were screaming over the static tearing out of the speakers. Their thermal visors were literally smoking behind the lenses, blinding them with a sea of red glare to the point where they couldn't even see their own fingers in front of their faces. The IF modules were throwing endless error codes, flagging the battle brothers standing shoulder to shoulder with them as high-threat hostiles. 2 troopers nearly pulled the trigger on each other point blank. The entire elite squad froze knee-deep in the dead leaves, too terrified to take a single step in any direction. Ice-cold sweat crawled down Valen's spine. He had executed vanguard infiltration protocols on 17 different colonial worlds, and he had never, not once, witnessed a cluster of thermal signatures with this kind of ludicrous density. The phantom ache of the Remington's kick still lingered in Mickey's shoulder pocket. Half-burnt tobacco flakes tumbled down his chin, bouncing off his winter coat and vanishing into the brush. He didn't even bother squinting to confirm his kill. The spent casing was still dancing and pinging on the metal floor of the blind when his bark rough hand snatched the civilian walkie-talkie off the rail. Calloused fingertips cranked the channel dial with a sharp click. He maxed out the volume, his gravelly roar vibrating the spiked coffee in his thermos. "Got a monster buck down in the holler, boys. Some kinda invisible heavy shell bastard that just ate a .308 and asked for seconds." The idle chatter floating over the CB radio. Guys bitching about muddy deer tracks, guys grumbling about their wives hiding the hunting ammo in the oven, went dead silent for 3 whole seconds. Then, the radio absolutely blew up. Dozens of whiskey-soaked, nicotine-stained baritones erupted through the static in a tidal wave of unhinged excitement. "Holy shit. Drop the coordinates, you old son of a bitch. Don't you hog it. I'm humping it your way right now. Got the 12-gauge pump. Heard that crack earlier. Thought your old ass missed. Guess you hit a real tough son of a gun." The overlapping hollering hammered the radio speaker so hard, the signal bars flickered like strobe lights. The wind in the woods changed flavor instantly. The crisp air, previously smelling of pine needles and frost, was suddenly laced with the distant guttural roar of Ford pickup trucks redlining their engines. A half-mile away on the ridge, hunters were screaming at the top of their lungs, rallying their buddies. Thousands of eyes hidden behind blaze-orange hunting gear simultaneously locked onto the bottom of the valley. Old Mickey slammed the radio down onto the armrest of the blind. Brown tobacco spit dribbled down the corner of his mouth as he hawked a loogie onto the dead leaves below. The recoil ache in his shoulder hadn't even faded before his knuckles gripped the cold metal bolt of his Remington 700. 3 miles to the east, a sharp metallic clack echoed. A split second later, a second one answered from the western draw. Within 2 seconds, a rolling wave of mechanical clatter cascaded down the ridgeline. Tens of thousands of well-oiled bolt actions were jerked back and shoved forward. Tens of thousands of gleaming brass, 308 rounds were chambered simultaneously, the overwhelming wall-to-wall sound drowning out the wind entirely. Mickey cast his eyes over the surrounding hills. Hundreds, thousands of blinding blaze orange specks bobbed in the cold mist. Hunters in high vis coats were going prone over granite boulders or racking bolts while kneeling on the hoods of their 4x4s. Every single muzzle was trained with dead-reckoning precision on that patch of empty broadleaf brush at the bottom of the valley. The CB radio was spitting sparks. It was so loud. Guys shouting range estimations. Guys calling dibs on chunks of armor for trophies. Hell, 2 old boys who got a late start and were stuck at the town shooting range were hollering that they were loading up the truck to run ammo supply lines up the mountain. Mickey seated the Remington stock firmly in his shoulder pocket, painting his crosshairs right back on the pile of leaves where Head had taken his first shot. His spiked coffee steamed right next to his hand, the harsh bite of chewing tobacco mixing with the scent of diesel wafting up the mountain. Down in the valley, patches of dead leaves began shivering uncontrollably. The crunch of snapping twigs bled out from multiple directions. It was brutally obvious. Those 10 cloaked alien vanguard troopers were utterly paralyzed, pinned down by an apocalyptic web of firing lines, terrified to even flinch. The external audio receptors picked up the crack of tens of thousands of rifles chambering rounds, slamming into Valen's tactical neural interface like a sledgehammer. He stared at the holographic display, now just a smeared, useless blob of thermal data. The comms from his 10 ground troopers were nothing but panicked static. These battle-hardened interstellar elites were now too scared to even turn their heads. If one so much as brushed a bush, they were screaming friendly. 3 times over the open frequency. Plumes of white smoke from burned-out thermal visors clouded their faceplates. With IF systems failing to read the insignia on their own brothers' chests, the half-blind soldiers were sitting ducks at the bottom of a kill box. Valen ground his back teeth together, siphoning a full third of the main shield's reserve processing power and violently smashing the drone deployment button on his console. The armored hatch on the roof of the stealth ship silently slid open. 5 palm-sized micro-drones, slathered in low albedo coating, launched into the air with a faint hum. The second their rotors spun up, they rocketed toward the sky, using the forest mist as cover. His fingers flew across the interface, charting a flanking retreat route through a gap in the eastern ridge. The plan was textbook. Wait for the drones to transmit high-altitude, high-res optical feeds, paint a safe path for the squad, and ghost them out of the encirclement before the indigenous forces could zero in on their exact positions. The 5 drones quickly cleared an altitude of 150 feet, their onboard HD cameras finally getting a clean sweep of the valley and the horrifying dense sea of blaze orange specks. Jim was leaning back against the rough bark of an oak, 2 empty beer cans rolling at his feet, his fingers still greasy from tearing into some deer jerky. He was holding his Remington 870 pump action, shaking his leg, currently complaining that old Mickey on the next ridge over was definitely drunk, and calling in invisible stumps as prize bucks. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he caught 5 tiny silver blurs shooting up above the tree line. The 5 micro-drones, despite their stealth coating, caught just a sliver of the cold morning light as they breached 150 feet. Jim's eyes bugged out. Just last week, the County Hunting Association sent out a newsletter about upgrading to moving electronic skeet targets to practice shotgun accuracy. Head tried to sign up 3 times and missed the cut, and now, here it was, a surprise beta test right on opening day. He snapped the shotgun stock right into his shoulder, screaming into his radio, "Pull!" The 12-gauge hammer dropped hard. The first shell exploded out of the barrel, dozens of lead pellets expanding into a palm-sized spread in midair. His wrist flicked the pump action like lightning. The spent hull went clink against the tree and vanished into the leaves. A second shell was chambered and fired in a heartbeat, sending another cloud of scalding lead chasing the exact trajectory of the first. Within a half-mile radius, over a dozen hunters rubbernecking at the sky heard him holler and reflexively shouldered their guns. Hundreds of shotgun blasts wove an impenetrable wall-to-wall net of lead across the cold blue morning sky, utterly blanketing the 5 drones before they could transmit a single panoramic shot back to the vanguard ship. Commander Valen's knuckles had just brushed the recon calibration key, prepping to pipe the drone feeds straight into his troopers' visors, when all 5 signal ports on the console simultaneously exploded into blinding white static. A piercing overload alarm ripped through the silence of the command deck. He slammed his fist down on the edge of the console, knuckles white, but the screen only vomited lines of blood-red error codes. Signal source physically destroyed. Data link permanently severed. Onboard core module shattered. The 5 bright green icons vanished one by one. The final frame transmitted was nothing but a tidal wave of lead-gray metallic dots completely blotting out the lenses. Cold sweat washed down Valen's spine. He had requisitioned these state-of-the-art stealth drones at immense cost from the homeworld armory. They were rated to survive the thermal friction of atmospheric re-entry. 10 seconds into flight, they had been blasted into unrecognizable scrap by a barrage of pure kinetic shotgun fire. High-altitude visibility was reduced to absolute zero. He frantically scrambled for backup recon protocols, only to realize the low-altitude blind spot coverage was hardwired to the drone's processing power. With the link dead, he couldn't even get a clean fix on his own 10 troopers standing a mere 30 feet away. The bulkhead vibrated against the relentless rolling thunder of hunting rifles outside. Valen stared at the holographic display, looking into that unfilterable, mountain-spanning ocean of red thermal signatures. He swallowed hard and snatched the emergency comms mic. He smashed the squad-wide broadcast key. Static flooded the command cabin. He cranked the volume to the max, roaring the order to push east and break the perimeter. The only response was broken, sputtering static. The thermal overload had fried the troopers' audio receivers to a crisp. They were reduced to relying on the base-level tactical locators implanted in their skulls, stumbling blindly toward the fallback coordinates. Valen pressed his face against the only viewport not scarred by flying gravel. The icy wind made the hull hum, and the rolling gunfire sounded like hail on a tin roof. He couldn't see his men, but he could sure as hell see the creeping trail of distortion tearing through the leaf-littered valley floor. Dead oak leaves were ground to dust. Pine needles kicked up in a wake. Every 2 seconds, the ear-piercing snap of a broken branch leaked through the hull seals. 10 pairs of heavily armored combat boots trudging through dead rot were making a racket so loud that even an unaugmented native could hear it halfway across the damn mountain. He slapped the console, trying to push a stay low and minimize noise override command, but the interface spat back a string of red warnings. The power armor weighed 3 times as much as standard recon gear. There was no physical way to tread lightly on half a foot of dry foliage. Every step pulverized the brush below. Optical camouflage could fool the eyes, but it couldn't hide raw physical mass. Valen's uniform was entirely saturated with cold sweat. He watched helplessly as that exposed trail of crunching leaves and snapping twigs blundered right toward the base of an oak tree, fitted with an elevated hunting blind. The lead scout's boot heel came down dead center on a dry hickory branch buried in the leaves. The snap easily penetrated 100 meters of thick woods, ringing out loud and clear right into the 15-foot-high blind. Old Mickey bit down hard on his cigar. The second that hickory branch cracked, he didn't even bat an eye. His knuckle tightened around the trigger guard of his Remington 700. He didn't need a damn optical scope. 40 years of deer hunting had tuned his ears to pinpoint that patch of brush with surgical precision. Down in the empty woods, a half-foot of dry leaves was churning all by itself. Mud and twigs were getting kicked up by invisible boots, like some giant, transparent wild boar was thrashing through the holler. With the stock planted firmly in the bruised pocket of his shoulder, he didn't bother lining up the crosshairs. He just pointed at the center of the commotion and pulled the trigger 3 times in rapid succession. 3 muffled booms echoed out. The supersonic 308 soft points hammered the fully charged alien personal shields, sparking 3 blinding arcs of blue electricity. The crackling showers of sparks bathed the swirling dead leaves in a ghostly blue hue. Sulfur smoke was still curling from Jim's Remington 870 when he caught sight of the blue shield sparks popping off in the valley. He let out a piercing, triumphant whistle. He charged down the ridge, boots crushing dead branches, his high-vis orange coat burning like a beacon in the morning mist. Behind him, dozens, then hundreds, of identically dressed hunters followed suit. A tide of hunter orange washed down the slope, their boots creating an absolute avalanche of crunching leaves. Nobody checked a tactical pad. Nobody calculated ballistic trajectories. These good old boys had spent half their lives in these mountains. They didn't even need to look down their scopes. Going purely off the rustling of leaves and the unnatural churning of the underbrush, they unanimously leveled their barrels at the epicenter of those dancing blue sparks. Jim wedged the stock against his shoulder, pad of his finger resting on the trigger, breath subconsciously held, muscle memory from 20 years of trap shooting. The radio channel was squealing with feedback until someone finally hollered, "Let EM have it, T." The first swarm of 12-gauge pellets tore through the chill air. In a split second, thousands of Remington 700 bolts locked home. A sheer wall of kinetic lead chased the buckshot, raining apocalyptic hellfire down onto the empty patch of dead leaves. Commander Valen's pupils shrank to pinpricks. A continuous cascade of red shield overload alarms blew out the ship's speakers simultaneously. The relentless barrage of hundreds of supersonic kinetic slugs didn't give the personal shields a millisecond to cycle a recharge. The energy bars of the 3 vanguard troopers on point were chopped down like they'd been hit by a meat cleaver, instantly replaced by 3 giant, red shield, compromised X-marks. Valen watched in absolute horror through the bulletproof observation glass. With the cracking sound of overloads, the optical camo on the 3 soldiers failed in unison. Their matte black, power-armored bodies crashed heavily into the dead leaves. Dark green blood began oozing from the armor seams, staining the dry foliage a sickly hue. The gunfire outside was a solid wall of iron, slamming into the valley. It rattled the vanguard ship to its core. The shield gauges of the 7 remaining troopers were hemorrhaging at a rate of 10% per second. 10 more seconds, and they'd be completely wiped out. When the number hit 12%, the console's overload alarm finally blew out the red-hot speakers with a deafening screech. He looked out the viewport. The horde of primates in blaze-orange coats raised their right hands to their mouths in terrifying unison. A split second later, hundreds of deer calls shrieked at once, a horrific pitch like glass scraping metal. The acoustic wave hit the stealth ship's alloy hull so hard that tactical helmets rattled off the bulkhead pegs and crashed to the floor. Cold sweat soaked right through the ballistic weave of Valen's uniform. He had commanded the interstellar vanguard in crushing organized resistance on 17 civilized planets, and not one of those militaries had ever employed such a tactically illogical high-frequency mass whistle right before a final assault. The 7 troopers, their audio modules already half-fried, were screaming over the cranial comms. The piercing whistles were short-circuiting their auditory loops, robbing them of their equilibrium. They couldn't even stand up straight. Their footwork turned into a frantic thrashing in the dead leaves, kicking up enough noise to be pinpointed from half a click away. Without a second thought, Valen slammed the comms output to maximum. He shrieked a top-level retreat order at his surviving men. All units abandon current tactical positions. Fall back to the vanguard ship's main energy shield perimeter at maximum velocity. Do not engage. Do not return fire. Haul your asses back here right now. The 7 blips jerked wildly on the holodisplay. The shield degradation rate spiked another 30% due to their frantic movement, dropping straight to 7%. Valen threw his entire body weight onto the main shield activation lever, his knuckles turning ghostly white. Outside, the shrieking whistles cascaded across the mountains. The orange figures were closing in so fast that the crunch of their boots snapping twigs bled right through the alloy hull into the command deck. Old Mickey spat out a wad of tobacco flex. It hit the half-foot pile of dead leaves below the blind with a muted thud. He grabbed the CB radio off his chest, his gravelly voice vibrating the speaker into static. Let him go. Stop chasing the little shits kicking up the leaves. The fire roads ain't blocked. Get those lifted Fords in here and crank those light bars to max. Light up the holler. A chorus of unhinged roaring laughter erupted over the channel. Less than 30 seconds later, the thunderous roar of diesel engines ripped down the logging roads. 3 F-150s with 6-inch lift kits smashed right through the hazelnut brush. The quad xenon light bars mounted on their brush guards kicked on simultaneously, the blinding ice blue beams cutting the forest mist to ribbons. A second wave, then a third wave of headlights flared up. Over a dozen pickup trucks rolled down the 3 dirt tracks, boxing in the center of the valley. The intersecting high beams lit up the woods like high noon. You couldn't find a shadow behind the skinniest twig if you tried. Old Mickey aimed his Remington 700 dead center into the convergence of the spotlights. The stealth vanguard ship previously swallowed by the gloom popped out like old film tossed into developer fluid. Its pitch-black metallic chassis was fully exposed. You could even see the red maple leaves wedged in its hull seams. Hundreds of blaze-orange figures hiding behind trunks and boulders stopped in their tracks. Hundreds of large-caliber hunting rifles raised in perfect unison, aiming dead at that big, naked metal shell trapped in the spotlight. Jim pressed his back hard against the rough oak bark, keeping his Remington 870 stock snug in his pocket. He locked his bead sights right onto that dark, cold, gleaming hull sitting helpless in the beams. God only knows whose rifle spit fire first. The next second, the entire valley exploded into a continuous, deafening thunderclap. Muzzle flashes from hundreds of heavy-caliber hunting rifles danced relentlessly in the cold light. Thousands of supersonic 308 soft points slammed into the vanguard ship's main shield, creating an impenetrable hail of metallic pings, like 10,000 blacksmiths hammering anvils all at once. The pale blue energy shield warped and rippled under the dense kinetic bombardment. The bleed-off shockwaves sent dead leaves swirling into the sky, while pulverized bullet fragments rained down, pockmarking the thin layer of frost below. Jim pumped 2 rounds of 12-gauge buckshot right into the brightest part of the shield, the lead splattering into blinding white scars on impact. He wiped mud off his cheek with his sleeve, listening to old Mickey coughing with laughter over the radio, telling the boys to save some ammo so they wouldn't shoot through next week's deer reserves on this hunk of junk. Next to Jim, a heavy-set guy in an orange coat racked his bolt so hard it clicked loudly. A scalding brass casing bounced right onto his jeans, making him yelp and jump before he backhanded a fresh round into the chamber. The ear-splitting barrage went on for 2 solid minutes. The vanguard ship's hull began to emit a screeching metallic whine as the shield vibrated at high frequency. Fine black metal dust shimmied out of the hull seams. A strange bioluminescent blue fluid began leaking from the airlock joints, leaving crooked trails on the frost that was half melted by the spotlights. Suddenly, the bulkheads of the stealth vanguard ship began vibrating wildly. Inside, every single tactical display flashed blinding, apocalyptic red. The high-frequency tremors pitched Valen hard over the console. His forehead slammed into the starship-grade alloy edge, splitting the skin and drawing blood. The strobing red light from the tactical screens was blinding. The blown-out speakers were practically stabbing his eardrums with a shrieking alarm. He braced himself against the console and immediately checked the life support metrics. The blue bar representing the main shield's power was nosediving before his eyes. The system's automated survival time projection spun wildly before locking on to 27 minutes 12 seconds, and that was assuming the enemy's rate of fire didn't increase. He swept his gaze over the external locator feed. The 3 red blips representing his vanguard point men were inching toward the ship. The pale green biofluid leaking from their ruptured armor dragged 3 crooked trails across the leaves. One of them couldn't even stand. He was clawing through the mud with his metal knuckles, dragging his broken body forward, kicking up a racket of snapping twigs with every agonizing lurch. Another wave of cold sweat weighed down Valen's soaked uniform. He had executed pacification sweeps on 3 different colony worlds, and the combined firepower of those interstellar resistance groups wasn't even a tenth of this. Who could have possibly predicted that a backwater planet's hunting season would mobilize hundreds of thousands of heavy-caliber kinetic weapons capable of shredding military-grade personal shields? Through the vibrating hull, he could hear the gleeful, bloodthirsty hollering of the blaze-orange natives, accompanied by the mechanical symphony of rifle bolts racking over and over. He grabbed the emergency processing allocation lever and ripped it down, dumping all the power from the environmental scanners straight into the airlock override. The jammed pressure doors screamed with hydraulic agony before popping open with a massive clang. The 3 critically wounded troopers practically rolled into the cabin, a cloud of dead leaves sucking in behind them on the negative pressure and plastering the console. Valen didn't even look at his gasping subordinates. His eyes were welded to the main shield gauge. It had dropped to 9%. Outside, a fresh volley of 1,308 rounds slammed into the perimeter, the sheer concussive force shoving the entire ship a half-meter sideways and plowing a trench into the frozen mud with its landing struts. He scrapped every single one of his occupation protocols. Pre-colonial deployment. Biosphere sampling. Absolute bullshit. He threw himself across the trembling console, grabbed the frost-covered emergency launch thruster lever, and slammed it all the way forward. The anti-gravity engines hit critical overload with a terrifying screech. The ship bucked like a giant underground hand had shoved it, launching a half-meter vertically. Unsecured tools and shattered tactical panels went flying, smashing against the metal bulkheads in a cacophony of clatter. The 3 wounded troopers hadn't even pulled their legs inside before a sudden 12G overload flattened them against the deck. The latches on their external armor plating, already rattled loose by 104.38 soft points, catastrophically failed. A dozen glowing ice-blue alloy plates broke off and tumbled out of the closing airlock, vanishing with muted thuds into the thick bed of dead leaves. Without a pre-calculated flight path, the vanguard ship just blindly rammed its way toward the canopy. The reinforced alloy nose snapped oak branches the size of tree trunks. Dozens of limbs, coated in ice and dead leaves, sheared off entirely, flung 50 yards away by the massive downdraft. The gash on Valen's forehead tore wider under the G-force. Warm blood blinded half his vision, but he didn't dare wipe it away. His eyes were fixed on the redlining engine thrust gauge. The main shield energy dipped into single-digit red numbers before flatlining to 0 the second they took off. The ship had literally 0 defensive shielding left, relying entirely on raw hull armor to deflect whatever stray rounds were inevitably sent their way. The 7 half-crippled troopers huddled in the corner of the cabin, clutching their smoking thermal visors. The tactical locators in their skulls were still screaming warnings. The deafening symphony of deer calls and rifle fire echoed endlessly in their minds, draining them of even the strength to raise a weapon. The stealth ship shot up like a tin can with a firecracker taped to it, plowing diagonally through the canopy and punching straight into the lead gray early winter clouds. The engine shriek that had vibrated the valley faded into the distance until it vanished completely. All that was left was a single glowing blue armor plate that slipped out of the airlock, landing with a loud clank in the scorched crater where the ship had sat. The relentless, hollering march of thousands of orange-clad hunters quickly converged on the clearing, boots stomping heavily down the fire roads. Old Mickey clicked the safety onto his Remington 700. Brown tobacco juice trickled down his stiff stubble as he took his sweet time climbing down the ladder of the 15-foot blind. The second his boots hit the leaf-covered ground, his ears were flooded with the chaotic hooting and hollering on the CB radio. Thousands of hunters were pouring into the holler from all directions, crunching twigs underfoot like a stampede. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and ambled over to the scorched blast crater left by the escaping ship. Half a dozen strapping young hunters in high-vis orange blew past him, too wired to even say hello. By the time he squatted by the edge of the crater, that last piece of glowing cold blue exterior armor had just rolled to a stop, still radiating the residual heat of the thrusters. He pinched the edge of the plate and lifted it up, testing the weight. It was heavy as hell. The surface was heavily dimpled with deep gouges, unmistakably chewed up by large-caliber soft points. Nail this bad boy to the barn door, and it'll look a hell of a lot cooler than a 10-point buck, he muttered with a satisfied grin. He shoved the alloy plate directly into the deep inner pocket of his winter coat, the rigid metal bulging against his ribs. Jim shouldered his way through the crowd of hunters ringing the crater. Faint blue cordite smoke was still drifting from the barrel of his 870. He spotted the edge of the glowing blue plate sticking out of Mickey's pocket and let out a whoop, making a grab for it. The surrounding hunters burst into roaring laughter. Guys were already down in the dirt, digging through the mud for leftover armor fragments. Somebody was hollering on Channel 4, telling the boys still driving up the mountain not to bother, because there wouldn't even be a screw left to scavenge by the time they arrived. The roar of modified pickup trucks on the fire road drew closer, the smell of diesel mixing with the crisp morning wind. Old Mickey unscrewed his thermos and took a massive swig of bourbon-spiked hot coffee. The burn made him hiss as he spat the rest of his chew into the leaves. He hollered at the top of his lungs to the sea of blaze-orange coats surrounding him. "Everybody head back to my farm tonight. I'm nailing this thing to the front barn doors as a welcome sign. Venison's on the house, bourbon's on the house. Whoever bagged the most alien scrap gets the head of the table." Up in the lead gray clouds, the faint white vapor trail completely dissipated, leaving absolutely no trace of the alien vanguard ship. Valen and his crippled strike squad were huddled in a ship with zero shielding, terrified to linger in the atmosphere for a single second longer. His mind was utterly broken by the mountain-spanning ocean of red thermal signatures and the hull vibrating thunder of hunting rifles. He couldn't even put together a coherent after-action report for Homeworld Command. As for the hunters of Pennsylvania, they didn't give a rat's ass about any interstellar invasion. All they knew was that on the first day of rifle season, every single one of them had bagged the ultimate trophy, A story they'd be bragging about until the day they hit the grave.
Finishing this story brought me a profound sense of absurd satisfaction. In traditional sci-fi tropes, an alien vanguard usually represents an insurmountable technological pinnacle, optical camouflage, personal energy shields, and micro-recon drones. They arrive on Earth with absolute arrogance, fully expecting to steamroll a lesser civilization. But I desperately wanted to shatter that cliché. What could be more intensely satisfying than dropping these haughty, interstellar elites right into the Appalachian Mountains of Pennsylvania on the opening day of deer hunting season? In this story, the real overwhelming force isn't the hyper-advanced aliens, but the grizzled local hunters armed with Remington rifles and thermos cups full of bottom-shelf bourbon. The aliens' prized optical camouflage becomes a joke against raw physical mass and dry leaves. Their energy shields, designed to absorb high-tech weaponry, are brutally shattered by thousands of rounds of pure kinetic energy from soft-point slugs and buckshot. At its core, this story isn't just about advanced weapons versus low-tech firearms. It's about the clash between calculated tactics and raw, instinctual wilderness. Old Mickey, Jim, and the rest of the hunters couldn't care less about grand narratives like an interstellar invasion or saving the world. To them, these alloy-plated aliens are simply the biggest, rarest bucks of the season. The image of hundreds of deer calls shrieking in unison and pickup truck spotlights blinding a stealth ship captures a raw, ruggedly human kind of romance. That's what I found most thrilling to write. When arrogant cosmic superiority meets the most stubborn, down-to-earth locals, all that advanced tech loses to a hunter deciding, I don't care what you are, eat a face full of 12 gauge.